Good afternoon. My name is Ian, and I am the head of product and R&D at Tailify. And today, I'm so grateful that you're here because I'm going to share with you something that I hope you'll find very, very interesting. This talk is about how learning to think like a behavioral scientist will take your influencer marketing to the next level. To introduce this subject, I really have to start by introducing myself and my journey to the heart of influence. I had to go back to the beginning. So I was born and raised in San Francisco in the Silicon Valley area, and my dad was an economist, an expert on how economies develop, in particular, how the economy of Silicon Valley developed. And he always included in his economic models some very simplistic assumptions about human behavior. And I never thought those made any sense. So my act of rebellion and integration was to really get deep into the problem of why human beings do what they do and how you can predict it at scale. So I studied cognitive science at Yale, which is the fusion of psychology, computer science, linguistics, neurobiology, and philosophy, and then decision science at the London School of Economics. Coming out of that, my first role was to predict the next Arab Spring for the US Department of Defense with a little organization called SCL, which happens to be the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. I was in their defense division. Cambridge Analytica was their elections division. And we were successfully able to predict the Arab Spring riots in Jordan using social media data from the region, and by understanding linguistically what were the psychometric drivers of behavior and being able to predict them. And that algorithm, that same approach, was later used by Cambridge Analytica in one form or another to help win the elections for Brexit and for Trump. So this demonstrated to me the incredible power of mass psychology, of tools of mass influence, but that they needed to be wielded in an appropriate way. So I spent the next decade or so building products at the intersection of data science, psychology, and software engineering for various e-commerce, retail, ad tech, med tech companies in and around London. And I joined Tailify just a year ago now to bring it all together, to answer the question which I had asked when I was a small boy about what was the nature of influence and how it could be measured, and to apply the value of mass influence tools at scale for good. Now that brings us to Tailify and Tailify's own journey. So we've been around for about 8 years. We're founded by 3 extremely friendly Scandinavians, which is a big part of why I'm here. And over that period, the organization has done a lot of influence marketing campaigns, just really churning through collaborations. And when lockdown came about, which I like to think of it as a retreat, as it forced everyone to stop and settle and to think, we all, when I got connected to the organization as well, we all got back and asked ourselves some of the big questions. We reset and we returned to why we got into this business in the first place and what we're really all about. And so one question we asked during lockdown is really, why are CPAs rising across once profitable paid channels? This is part of the reason why we were growing so much, because brands were struggling to attract customers at the rates they used to through the former money makers, Google and Facebook. And that question was a portal to a number of other interesting questions. And we noticed 3 things, 3 key trends driving consumers to shift their trust and attention off of these traditional channels and onto online influencers. Trend number 1 was choice overload, the incredible proliferation of options and available choices to make, which feature those options, which has been enabled by digital technology, in particular the internet. Now, as our options have expanded, our brains simply have not. And that's led us to extend our cognitive network to other individuals, to rely upon social proxies to make these decisions. It's made us ever more reliable on others to make these decisions. And we have so many other choices to choose from. You know, it's not simply a matter of watching the same commercials as everyone else is watching on the BBC or NBC. No, now we have millions, even billions of sources to choose from to get this information, a huge proliferation of sources. And the combination of that reliance upon social proxies and the availability of those social proxies has been compounded by the collapse of mainstream trust. This is a graph of to what extent people trust the tech giants. And the graph for the mainstream media sources are even worse. And this is the really big shift which has happened in the last couple of years. The others have been building for a while, but this has been the tipping point that have pushed people away from traditional sources of influence and onto self-chosen sources of influence, namely influencers that people don't trust. People don't trust the companies that are serving the ads. They don't trust the traditional sources of information. And the result of that is rather filtering out advertisements, these influences directly through ad blockers or indirectly just through basic psychological filtering through source blindness. So what's the result of all of this? We put a name on it. We called it the influence economy. And the influence economy is a world in which people only trust those whom they trust, and whom they trust. They don't trust platforms or businesses, they trust individuals. And that the only way to get to a consumer's mind or heart is to go through the influencers they trust. And that access point, that bridge that only influencers will have, will create a world in which the economy effectively revolves around them. This was the future we saw coming. This was our vision. I want to dramatize that future because it's really crazy and really inspiring to me. So in this future, there will be a product that will be an ad exchange interface powered by AI, which will make influence as accessible to work with as social ads, as Google and Facebook is today, and more consistently profitable than any other channel. There will be a way that influence can be scaled. This certainly doesn't exist today. But once that happens, brands will shift their budgets from simply buying attention with low conversions to a winning influence. And we know we were there when over half of brands have put over half of their marketing budget towards influence. Now, if that actually happened, this industry would go by 15x, from 10 billion where it is now to 150 billion, or 25% of global ad spend. For influencers, this would mean that more could feed their families by using their voice. I'd like to see 100 million full-time influencers employed. Now, there are that many influencers today, but they're not full-time. My wife is one of them. She's an incredible YouTuber, but she simply doesn't get the partnerships that monetize the value of her channel that she would need in order to contribute at the level that she could be. I certainly wouldn't have this setup if she didn't do that work. And the consequence for media was that legacy media monopolies would be displaced in importance by decentralized communities of creators. Google and Facebook aren't going away, at least not fundamentally, but the war chest which they built up on monetizing peripheral attention will be shifted to the creators that are more at root of the value. And for consumers, the impact for the everyday person was that there will be a vibrant community for every aspiration, which will accelerate the development of our individual and collective potential. Whatever it is you want to be, do, or have in this life, from playing guitar or learning to be a superhero, there will be a community of full-time creators that will be out there incentivized to create amazing content for you and find you the best products and services to help you forward on your journey. Whatever it is you want to transform, that will be out there. So the influence economy is going to be a beautiful world for the individual, but there's going to be a lot of change. And it's very exciting. So why isn't it here yet? Well, we are betting at Tailify that it's influencer selection that's holding back the industry. And here's why. Well, it's because here's some qual evidence. A survey by eConsultancy last year asking what's been the biggest challenge of working with influencers. And top of the list was identifying the right influencer, unsurprisingly. We also see some quant evidence to support this. This is an ROI by influencer graph sorted by the highest ROI to the left, going to the lowest ROI on the right, of over 250 influencers that a particular brand has worked with, the return on investment they generated. Now, what you'll notice that this is not a particularly exciting graph. Less than 7.5% of these influencers were profitable, which means that you paid them $1,000 and they gave you $1,000 in measurable sales in return. Over double of them were total busts, which means that you give them $1,000 and they give you nothing. And there is an average ROI of -54% across the whole group. Now, you wouldn't want to put your money in this machine, would you? However, What's really attractive and which keeps this brand coming back is that top 1% delivered over half of the ROI. So the natural question was, what if brands could consistently select outstanding ROI influencer collaborations? What if you could just get that head? Because this isn't purely roulette. It's not random. There's methods to the madness. There are reasons for success. Success leaves clues. And if we could find the clues to that success, then we could replicate these results in a predictable way. But it's impossible. It's computationally impossible for the best brains armed with today's best technology, because there's over 100 million influencers via social data, which is just one social search tool. And those influencers are distinguished by hundreds of meaningful attributes. So if you want to find the best influencer in that mix for your brand, you have to answer these 4 questions. First, which attributes are potentially predictive of ROI? Engagement rate, that seems natural. Everyone has access to that. What about authenticity? That seems to make sense. People talk about that. Does the number of time an influencer smiles make a difference? Laugh? What about the length of their videos, the shortness of their videos, when the integration is? There are so many possible factors. And how can you actually measure these attributes effectively? What does authenticity even mean? Can you measure how humorous an influencer is in a comparable way across different influencers? And which of the attributes are most important for performance? So you could measure authenticity. Is that more important than engagement rates or less important than engagement rates? And then fine, so you can do all those things. Now do it 100 million times. This is a matchmaking problem of the highest order, a decision matrix of incredible complexity, and it's simply impossible for a human mind, even on with today's best technology, to actually fathom. The only way out is by expanding human cognitive capacity through the power of artificial intelligence. And if you really wanted to solve this problem, really you would need to develop incredible expertise in 3 particular areas. Behavioral science, you need to know what actually drives behavior, what conceptually in reality makes the difference for influencers who really convert and influencers who don't. Then data science. You would need to download the intelligence of that behavioral scientist who's looking at all of these cues and indicators into an algorithm that was able to actually replicate those judgments at scale. And then data engineering. You would need to be able to build a system that pulls in all this information in real time and is able to make these predictions and find the best influencers in an efficient and scalable way that's such that it could actually be used as a search tool. So we realized this. So we just got started. We built a team of behavioral scientists, data scientists, and data engineers. And we together built a system. And we call this system FIDES, an influencer selection AI trained to think like a behavioral psychologist. Why FIDES? FIDES is the Roman goddess of trust and good faith. And we think that trust and good faith is fundamentally what this industry needs right now. It is the reason why influencer marketing is niche and not mass, because influencers can't trust that brands are going to consistently come through, and brands can't trust that influencers are going to consistently come through and deliver high ROI. If we could all trust that we would get positive ROI transactions and all interactions and transactions were win-win, then this industry would explode in a very short period of time. So we think FIDES as a name represents the kind of transformation we'd like to see in the industry. Now, teaching FIDES why some collaborations cause behavior change and others do not really requires a vast corpus of knowledge. There is a lot of ink that has been spilled, a lot of research that has been done into why people do what they do in response to any kind of a stimulus, online or not. So we've had to distill down that corpus of knowledge and teach FIDES how to think like a behavioral scientist, because behavioral science is a pretty vast field. Just as an example of one thing we taught FIDES, I wanted to talk a little bit about this part of identity theory. Now, if you were to ask what makes an influencer collaboration effective, you might say something like authenticity at some point. Now, authenticity is an interesting construct. One way you might operationalize it this way, that authentic relationships are based on shared core values. Now, that's a fine intuition. How do you actually measure shared core values in a rigorous way? So we tried it. We created a tool which allows us to profile the 11 core values that distinguish any given brand or influencer. So Here's what we did for one of our clients, Rosetta Stone. We inventoried their 11 core values. As you can see, they index quite highly on these kind of agentic achievement explorative values like achievement, joy, functionality, honesty, and prestige. And incidentally, Tailify happens to have a pretty strong overlap when we did this, when we did an inventory of our own values with Rosetta. So maybe that's why they're one of our biggest clients. And it turns out that the overlap of the values profiles of different brands also predicts performance for influencers. So Jake the Korean Dream, a great Korean language learning influencer, has a high values congruence and also high sales per 1,000 views. You see a particularly strong indexing on joy and achievements, and these values of just kind of pushing yourself and figuring things out. Whereas for another Korean language learning influencer, Very French Trip, a group of French girls living in Korea, you see that they've got a much lower values fit or values congruence score. They index much more highly on more feminine relational values like safety and intimacy and care and affection. Now, these are anecdotes, but you see over a larger data set, a very strong and promising correlation between the return on investment multiple, which an influencer will get, and the extent to which they share their core values. Now, Rosetta Stone this is a small data set, and they're a pretty values-driven brand. But if you look at a larger data set, n equals 85, and another brand, we also see a strong correlation, not quite as strong, it's 0.28, but we see something even more interesting, namely that virtually all high-performing influencers shared most of the brand's core values. So over 90% of the influencers, just under 90% of the influencers who are high-performing, had shared most of the brand's core values. Now, there were many influencers who shared the brand's core values who did not perform well, and that's because performance is a multi-dimensional thing. There's still many ways you can mess up collaboration due to poor creative or any number of factors. But there were very, very, very few influencers who did really well who did not share core values. Implication: core values congruence is necessary but not sufficient for exceptional influence performance, crucial but not exhaustive. There are many other factors which come into play, and we're looking into noun detection. We're looking into real-time facial expressions, the extent to which micro-expressions displayed, particularly during sponsored post promotions, predicts your ability to convert. And we're looking at audience propensity to buy as expressed through comments. This particular comment says, "Love the style, I also need the t-shirt." If that comment had said, "I love your eyes," that influencer would not do as well, we found mathematically. Now, that's just a great AI, but we actually see the best results for solving the influencer selection problem when combining human and artificial intelligence, which is just generally a principle in the field. So here's a case study with Rosetta Stone, where we brought in we started with a potential set of 100 million influencers. We then narrowed that down through FIDES using some influencer mapping technology, and our strategy team defining the territories based on that intel that we should search for influencers in. We then trawled for a set of influencers, and then we cleansed down that data set through deduping and removing influencers that did not have complete data to a more manageable set of 19,000. We then used FIDES to do a first wave of prediction and filtering using primarily that ROI prediction metric, which we're able to give, and a bunch of other basic engagement filters as well. And then we combine the intelligence of FIDES to do some deeper analysis, as well as human raters who do expert psychometric evaluation and judgment for whether an influencer is really going to fit for a particular campaign. Then there's a final team judgment combining some collective human intelligence. And then finally, we negotiate for the lowest CPM to get the highest ROI possible influencers for a given brand. So from 100 million down to 10, using the combination of human and artificial intelligence. What does all this mean in terms of actual results? Well, this is what gets me really excited, which is that FIDES heralds the potential for a game-changing elevation in performance. So that brand that showed us that initial graph, well, they shared with us their data, all their historical data, to ask us whether we could find any patterns and what determines success. And the answer was absolutely yes. So it was negative 54% across the whole sample set. But if they had only selected the influencers that FIDES had suggested, then the overall ROI would have been plus 100%. They would have doubled their money instead of losing half. And that's a 3x increase in ROI. it's effectively as if we had just snipped off the tail and left the head. So are you interested in seeing what FIDEs can do for you? We're offering a free bespoke AI report detailing your brand's distinctive influencer ROI predictors and quantifying the estimated uplift FIDEs would generate for your brand. To find out if you qualify, just email me at ian.randolph@tailify.com and include the word FIDEs in the subject line so that I know that it's you. I want to share these results, not just to talk about the work that we've done because I think it's exciting, but to really encourage you. Because with high predictable return on influence, the influence economy is on the horizon. An extremely exciting era is dawning for our industry and for the world. And our industry will be a huge part of the transformation that is going on. And so I want you to get your hopes up. And if you want to work with us to be part of this new dawn, to relieve the constraint holding back this new dawn from coming back, we'd love to work with you in any respect. We don't just see ourselves as an agency that is trying to help our clients to succeed. That's necessary, but not sufficient. What really inspires us is creating this future for the world and leveling up the industry as a whole. So thank you so much for your attention and enjoy the rest of the conference and have a wonderful day.